More often than not, video games require players to beat up evildoers or slay scary monsters throughout their runtime. Combat systems are an integral part of many games, but what exactly makes the great ones truly stand out? Like what makes fighting enemies in a game like Devil May Cry so much more than just mindlessly pressing buttons? Well, by looking at a few things that games with amazing combat tend to excel at, I think we can get a good idea of the answer to this question. Since we're talking about video game combat, you probably already expected Dark Souls to pop up somewhere in this video, so I'm gonna try to be a special snowflake by talking more about Sekiro instead. The Soulsborne series is a great example of good learning curves in combat because the games place a really big focus on the player's personal improvement as they progress. Sekiro introduced many new defensive options like deflection, jumping, and even a little bit of perfect dodging. Together with the design of enemy movesets, a system was created where the player would have to quickly react to not just an enemy attack, but also what kind of an attack the enemy was throwing out. Sidestepping doesn't work on sweep attacks, and thrust attacks and grabs can't be blocked. Players had to learn the telegraphs of different attack types so they could react accordingly, and also get better at deflecting due to the game's posture system. A big reason why many fans, including myself, love the combat of Sekiro and other Miyazaki games so much is because when you overcome a strong enemy or a boss in these games, you know that the main reason you managed to succeed wasn't just because of some stat upgrade or ability that made the fight easier. It's because you got good. You learned how to time your deflects better, you figured out the counterplay to the enemy's moveset, and you applied that knowledge in real time to win the fight. The only real difference between your first and last attempt was that you were simply just better at the game, which is what makes the success players experience in these difficult games feel so well earned. But learning curves aren't just present in difficult games like Dark Souls and Sekiro. Take a look at this clip of me playing Devil May Cry 5 for the first time in 2 years. Now take a look at this clip of my friend Nicole playing the game. Could you tell who's better at the game? Hopefully the clips are contrasting enough for you to be able to arrive at the answer, but in case you couldn't tell, the answer here is definitely Nicole. Devil May Cry games are great examples of good learning curves in action games that aren't solely targeted towards people who desire a challenge. There's such a wide variety of advanced techniques and combos you can pull off using DMC5's system that made me feel like I barely even scratched the surface of what was possible in the game even after I beat it, and players far more skilled than myself have found so many incredible ways to pull off crazy and stylish combos. Like, how do you even do stuff like this? I've played through the entire game and I don't have the slightest idea how this combo is done. In both examples, the combat systems are hard to master, but at the same time they're interesting and cool enough for you to bother learning them, and the player is also rewarded for taking the time to improve at the combat. Now that we've seen some examples of good learning curves, how exactly does a game achieve this? I think the answer comes in the form of two words that you've probably heard before, which are complexity and depth. Complexity refers to how, for a lack of a better word, complex the rules of a system are and how difficult it is to understand how things work. Depth refers to how hard it is to truly master everything the system has to offer, even after you know all of its rules. On one hand, complexity is rewarding in the short run and allows players to feel satisfied with themselves after getting the hang of the system and becoming more comfortable with it. Having too much complexity can be off-putting for many, but you usually want to have at least a decent amount of it to make it fun to learn how the game works. But have you ever beaten an encounter in an action game and thought to yourself, damn, that was pretty fun, but I feel like doing it again because I think I could have played that better or done it in a cooler way? If you've ever thought something like this, that's the result of the game system having good depth. Or it could also just be that you're really bad at a shallow game, but I like to think the people who bother watching this shit are pretty high on the gamer scale. Depth is what allows a game's combat to keep players interested over a long period of time, and is extremely important to have in games that are either very lengthy or primarily focus on combat encounters. Whoa, hey buddy, what are you doing here? Oh, we were just getting to you. If a game's combat doesn't have enough depth, it easily becomes stale after spending enough time with it because the system becomes much less interesting when you realize you've seen everything it has to offer. Or to put things more specifically, doing the same full burst combo on a bunch of enemies is a lot less fun when you've done it a few hundred times. Depth can also come from other things besides just difficult combos. A lot of the depth in games like Monster Hunter, Dark Souls, and Nioh stems from the way enemy movesets are designed to force players to learn attack patterns. Combat in general should also provide a certain amount of challenge for the player regardless of how easy or hard the game is meant to be overall. Ghost of Tsushima and The Witcher 3 both don't have combat that's super varied, but they're constantly testing your reflexes and awareness to keep you engaged. The point of this entire section is essentially that learning curves which don't allow the player to hit the skill ceiling of the game too early are amazing for keeping them interested in the combat and wanting more, and is also what keeps them coming back just to appreciate the game's combat even after they've beaten it. While the topic of depth is still somewhat fresh, let's go ahead and talk about diversity. What I mean by diversity is the number of options players are given within a combat system to deal with enemies in fun and creative ways. To which you might be thinking, well wait a second teacher, isn't that kind of the same thing as depth? Depth is certainly a product of diversity, but not necessarily the other way around. Having good depth isn't always tied to the number of ways to deal with an encounter. For instance, you can argue that in a game like Sekiro, there really isn't that much variety in the ways that you can deal with bosses. So why exactly is diversity a good thing? To put things very simply, it allows you to express yourself within the game and deal with obstacles in your own unique way. So to start out, let's take a look at this clip of Judgment's combat. As it plays out, I'm also going to point out all the different moves being used as they appear. This is how many different moves and combos were used, and it doesn't even factor in shit like style switching and the boost mode. How hard is it to pull these off? Not very. They're pretty easy actually. Judgment's combat system doesn't retain the player's interest by having very deep mechanics that require hours of practice to master. It does so simply by letting the player be expressive. Is this guy pissing you off? Fucking tiger drop his ass. Feel like being an asshole? You can taunt this enemy and embarrass him in front of his friends. The variety of moves available for the player means that there's an abundance of ways they can deal with encounters, giving them the ability to craft their own experiences with them that feel more personal. Still not convinced? Let's look at another case study. You may have heard of this game before. It's kind of a big deal. And yes, I can already hear some of you thinking, Breath of the Wild's not an action game. Okay, fine. It's an action-adventure game. Okay, well, will you give me that one? As opposed to giving Link a wide variety of moves and abilities, the diversity in Breath of the Wild's combat comes from the fact that everything in the game's engine, even mechanics that aren't primarily meant for fighting enemies, have useful interactions even during combat. Wind from a Korok leaf can be used to push an enemy off a cliff if they're frozen. Fire creates updrafts which allow you to access better vantage points, and ice can also be used as protection against certain attacks. You're never just limited to hitting enemies with your weapons. Each and every single one of the game's mechanics is at your disposal. Star Platinum Zanwado! 時は動き出す This game is so fucking fun. There's such an exponentially huge number of ways to approach fights, and a lot of the long-term enjoyment from the combat comes from the ability the game gives you to constantly be creative and defeat bad guys in fun and interesting ways. To put things simply, it's just really fun to fuck around with the game's engine. Impact is a word that you're most likely familiar with when it comes to discussing video game combat, because it's important to give weight to the attacks the player throws out and provide a satisfying feedback loop every time they land a hit. Impact is achieved mainly using two things: animation and sound. On the animation side of things, you have the player and the enemy's animations. In God of War, Kratos has these huge startup animations before and after performing a heavy attack, which really show how much strength he's putting into his moves. And look at the way the enemies recoil and get blown back depending on how hard you're hitting them. Do you feel powerful yet? Heat actions in Yakuza games and Judgment are all super well choreographed and over the top, which makes them fun to watch. But apart from just having good attack and damage animations, there are a lot of other effects animators use to illustrate impact as well. Notice how the part of Yagami's body he's using to hit enemies glows as he attacks. Sekiro uses these motion lines to show the shape of some special attacks, and in Hades, the damage numbers also change in color and size depending on the build you're using. The point I'm trying to make here is really just that animators don't get paid enough for what they do. The thing about sound design is that good sound design often goes unnoticed because people tend to not really pay that much attention to it, but whenever there's bad sound design, you'll almost immediately realize it because of how off-putting it is. Let's look at this short clip of Dark Souls 3's combat. Now let's watch it again with some random stock sound effects. Obviously, this is a little bit of hyperbole on my part, but the point is that sound also plays a huge role in making attacks feel more satisfying to land. Hollow Knight doesn't have very mind-blowing animations, but listen to the sound the game makes whenever you hit something. Oh! Animation and sound can also be used to provide feedback for other things in combat besides the impact of an attack. Platinum Games is really fucking good at this. Astral Chain sync attacks wouldn't be nearly as satisfying to pull off if not for this extra sound effect playing every time you do one successfully. Nier Automata's perfect dodge both looks and sounds super cool. There are many other examples I could show, but I think you get the idea by now of the importance of visual and auditory appeal. This probably sounds weird, but the big idea of this chapter is that you want the player to feel good for hitting someone. This last topic is kind of commonsensical, which is why I left it to the end. You probably already know this, but the rules of a system need to be consistent in order for it to be rewarding to even learn it in the first place. The two people who watch my videos would know that I'm not the biggest fan of the combat in Xenoblade 2 and Monster Hunter, but even I can appreciate the consistency of the rules in both these systems. Building your party a certain way in Xenoblade 2 always allows you to pull off the same blade combos, and pretty much every enemy can be hit with the game's driver combos as long as you do them correctly. Monster Hunter's dodge roll is useless, but it's at least consistently useless, so you know to use the dive instead if you need iframes. And most damage types are effective against every monster, so you don't have to worry about upgrading a weapon and not being able to use it later on. On the other hand, Bed of Chaos is infamous for being a piece of shit, because it's the only fight that basically takes everything you know about Dark Souls' combat system and throws it in the trash. Rolling doesn't work properly against its attacks, locking on is basically non-existent because the camera is always in a shitty angle, and it's more of a Super Mario Sunshine level than it is a combat encounter. The rest of the game's really good though, no shade to Dark Souls 1. Honestly, it's pretty hard to fuck consistency up, but I felt like it was worth mentioning anyway. We've talked a lot about these traits that good combat systems have and why they're important, but what happens when they're missing? Let's talk a bit about Musou games, or more specifically Persona 5 Strikers, because that's the one I played the most recently. While it's cool that every character has one unique ability, all their combos are super basic, are pretty much the same, and never evolve throughout the game. There isn't anything for you to get better at doing, and you're restricted to the same few combos that become a lot less fun to mash when you've been doing it for 30 hours. So it's no wonder these types of games are notorious for being shallow and repetitive. You guys know I fucking love the Yakuza series, but why the fuck did they get rid of style switching in the Dragon Engine games? In Yakuza 6, not only does Kiryu have just a fraction of the moves he had in Kiwami, they made his grab finishers the same for all his combos, so he practically has even less moves than he did even before they introduced multiple styles. So much of the diversity and expressiveness from the previous games was lost, and you end up using the same few moves all the time. Code Vein has some pretty enjoyable combat overall in my opinion, but if I was to compare the impact of the attacks in this game to Dark Souls 3, the hits definitely feel a lot less weighty and satisfying due to the lower quality of the animations. So to conclude this video, these are the 4 traits I think great combat systems share, and I really only have one thing left to say, which is that I'm really fucking excited for Elden Ring. Holy shit, it looks so fucking cool. If you're somehow listening to this, I hope you found this video somewhat insightful or entertaining. And if you did, you know, hit X on the like button, you know, like press attack on the like button, you know what I'm saying? If you're interested, you can check out some of the other shit on my channel. Maybe subscribe if you want to see more. Fuck. You can find me on other platforms by the names that are probably on the screen somewhere too. Thank you for taking the time out of your day to watch my stuff as usual. Until we see each other again.